High above the Japanese island of Yakushima, American bombers sweep across the sky, ready to unleash yet another wave of destruction on the battered nation. The pilots are confident. There's no one left who still dares to challenge them. But then, out of the clouds, something flashes past the formation. Before the Americans can even identify the threat, tracers rip across the fuselages. These aren't desperate kamikazes. These are the Empire's last squadron of elite fighters, forged from its most battle-hardened survivors. The US bombers try to shake them, but it's no use. The N1K2-J Shiden-Kais they're up against are as sharp as the aces commanding them, slicing through the formation with impressive ease as cannons line up for a clean hit. It's August 1st, 1945, but over the skies of Japan, the war is not yet over. By late 1944, it was only a matter of time before the Philippines were liberated from their Japanese captors. After months of some of the bloodiest battles the Pacific had ever seen, the US Army had carved its way to the Leyte Gulf, right at the center of the islands. As the shoreline came into view, thousands of sailors darted across decks and pilots climbed into cockpits as they prepared for the final strike. Aboard the carrier USS Sanlo, the control room monitored the fighters as they took off from the carrier's runway. Pilots made bombs and torpedoes rain down on Japanese ships ahead, clearing the path to the American push. But before the enemy could be crushed for good, alarms began to blare across Sanlo. A lookout had spotted danger on the horizon. Orville Battered, one of the crew members serving on the carrier that day, rushed out of his station to scan the sky. For months, American sailors had endured swarms of Japanese aircraft attacking in tight formations, dropping dozens of bombs on their fleet before the Americans had time to react. However, the moment Battered looked up, he could tell this attack would be different. It wasn't a formation of Japanese fighters the carrier was up against, but rather a single lone aircraft tearing towards Sanlo at top speed, angling for the stern as if it was attempting to land. Years later, Battered would recall, quote, "It flew about 300 miles an hour. You don't do that to make a landing. And this plane came in probably 20 yards above the deck at the most. And then he crashed his plane. We blew ourselves apart from there." The Americans didn't know it yet, but this was no accident. The pilot had intended to crash into their vessel. Battered and his comrades had just become some of the first victims of Japan's newest tactic, the kamikaze attack. Flames spread across the carrier's hull, towers of black smoke rising from miles over the Gulf. Within 30 minutes, Sanlo slipped beneath the waves, taking more than 100 men with her. Battered was one of the lucky ones, surviving only by clinging to floating wreckage until rescue arrived. However, even in the face of such a dramatic strike, the Americans knew they still held the upper hand, and the only reason Japan had turned to a drastic attack like this one was out of pure desperation. Back home, the Empire was crumbling. Bombing raids were leveling cities. Fuel shortages were slowly choking the war effort, and no matter how many planes or ships Japan threw into battle, the US advance across the Pacific seemed unstoppable, with the Allied fleet sailing a little bit closer to the shores of Japan with each passing day. By the end of the fight at Leyte Gulf, American beachheads had been secured on the island. The liberation of the Philippines was underway. If Japan hoped to slow down the Allies' invasion, it would need more than planes falling from the sky. Before the war with America in the Pacific began, Japanese General Minoru Genda had already attempted to neutralize the US Navy threat. Working alongside Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, he helped shape the plan to strike Pearl Harbor, drafting a strategy designed to inflict maximum destruction on the American fleet. Genda believed that by crippling the US from the very beginning, Japan could seize total dominion over the Pacific before the Allies had the time to stop them. Although the attack succeeded in delivering one of the most devastating blows in American history, it ultimately failed to secure the strategic outcome Genda had hoped for. Instead of retreat, America unleashed the full force of its industrial power, capable of producing hundreds of aircraft, warships, and weapons in a matter of months. Now, Genda had to once again search for a way to counter the American advance. This time, however, the situation was more desperate. With every defeat, his chances of mounting an effective counteroffensive grew slimmer. Entire fleets had been annihilated, critical islands lost, and the empire around him was cracking. Shortly after the defeat at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese command began receiving waves of requests from pilots volunteering for kamikaze duty. These men believed that if victory was no longer possible, then sacrificing their lives to deliver one final strike against the enemy was the only honorable way to go. But Genda refused to let talented pilots go to waste in one-way missions. So when a request arrived from Naoshi Kano, one of Japan's most gifted squadron commanders, asking to transfer to a kamikaze unit, his application was swiftly refused. Kano was far too valuable. A fighter ace who'd flown in some of the fiercest battles across the Pacific, known amongst fellow pilots for his precision in the skies. There were even rumors that he'd downed as many as a dozen Grumman F-6F Hellcats alone. For Genda, sending a man like this on a kamikaze mission would have been madness. The general had other plans for pilots like Kano. Instead of giving up their lives, they would be part of a new elite force that would challenge the Allies head-on, composed of the best aces Japan still had left. The force would be known as the 343rd Naval Air Group, with 343 Kokutai, and they'd be formally established on December 25th, 1944. Now, all Japan could hope for was a Christmas miracle. Even with the most skilled pilots of Japan gathered into a single unit, General Minoru Genda knew that the 343rd Naval Air Group would still need something more to win the fight ahead, an edge sharp enough to match the Allied fighters that were rapidly earning American pilots aerial supremacy across the Pacific. Among the main opponents Japanese aviators faced in the final years of the war, none was more feared nor despised than the F-6F Hellcat, the ultimate American Avenger. Built with self-sealing fuel tanks and some of the thickest armor seen on any wartime fighter, the Hellcat could soak up an almost unnatural amount of hits and still keep flying. Still, its shield wasn't even the worst part for the Japanese pilots going up against them. Armed with 6 50-caliber Browning machine guns, backed by deep ammunition belts, and in some variants, even 20mm cannons, the Hellcat could not only shred enemy fighters without breaking a sweat, it could also bring entire airfields to ash and hammer warships until they disappeared below the surface. By comparison, Japan's main carrier-based fighter, the A6M0, which had dominated the skies across the Pacific early in the war, was hopelessly outclassed. Its feather-light frame, once the key to lightning-fast victories, had become a liability. Against the Hellcat, Zeros would often fall with a single hit, being engulfed in flames that only died out once they crashed against the sea below them. Worse still, after years of combat, American pilots had learned the Zeros inside and out. They'd memorized its flaws, mastered the tactics to counter it, and were able to bring them down without even having to rely on their superior firepower or speed. If the 343rd was to stand a chance, it needed a machine that could at least meet the enemy on equal terms. For this, Japan had one last warbird waiting in the wings. The chosen aircraft was the N1K2-J Shiden, which translates to Violet Lightning. It was faster than the Zero and fitted with an innovative mercury switch that automatically deployed combat flaps in hard turns, giving pilots tighter maneuverability in dogfights. However, the Shiden was far from perfect. Its engine was known for being temperamental, giving pilots a hard time the minute they pushed it too hard. And its long, fragile landing gear often failed, sending aircraft skidding or collapsing on runways. Because of this, more than one doubted that the Shiden could even take off. Yet Japan could not afford to simply abandon the aircraft. The war had reached a point of no return, and there was no time to go back to the drawing room. One way or another, the Shiden had to work. Within months, engineers stripped down and rebuilt the fighter. They lowered the wings, shortened the landing gear, lengthened the fuselage, and reduced the weight by more than 550 pounds. The result was a faster, more stable, more reliable machine that still allowed pilots to have an edge during dogfights. This redesign was known as the N1K2-J Shiden-Kais, and shortly after its first flight in early 1944, it proved it could hold its own against even the finest American fighters. But time and resources were running out. While nearly 11,000 Zeros had rolled off assembly lines during the war, only about 415 Shiden-Kai fighters were ever built. They would never match the Hellcats' overwhelming numbers, which had already swollen to over 12,000 strong. And so, only Japan's very best aviators had the honor of flying the Shiden-Kai. And amongst those selected few were the pilots of the 343rd Naval Air Group. By early 1945, there was virtually no chance for Japan to win the war, yet the elite squad still climbed into their Shiden-Kais and took off. At the front of the line was Kaneyoshi Muto. Standing just 5'3", he never stood out among the other young farmers working the fields. But at 19, he joined the Navy and soon began racking up victories over China in the war that foreshadowed World War II. Although he hadn't taken part in Pearl Harbor, Muto was sent on a near-simultaneous, equally critical strike meant to cripple American defenses, this one over the airfields of the Philippines, helping secure the nation's eventual capture. By the time Muto joined the 343rd Kokutai, he was already a legend, with well over a dozen victories under his belt and a prominent role as an instructor, shaping a new generation of flyers who rose into some of Japan's finest airmen. He was not the kind of pilot the Americans wanted to encounter in the air, and with the new N1K2-J Shiden-Kai under his command, there was no place to hide from him. As American B-29 superfortresses pushed toward key island bases and later Japan cities, Muto rushed to intercept. These were not easy attackers to bring down. They cruised above 30,000 feet at about 350 miles per hour. Even if a Japanese fighter clawed up to that height, catching the bomber was nearly impossible. The superfortress could absorb numerous hits and keep going, forcing long, grinding attacks. Yet its hunters didn't have the luxury of time, and every burst at a B-29 invited a reply from interlinked sights and remote turrets that could strike back from nearly every angle. However, even against these flying giants, Muto never backed away from a fight. He'd push his aircraft to the edge, climbing impossibly high, knifing through tracer fire, and answering with round after round from his 20mm cannons. It's said his formation eventually brought down 4 of these titans, returning to base unscathed each time. In February 1945, the Japanese command reported a wave of attackers inbound. Once again, Muto was dispatched to intercept before they reached their target. Flanked by 8 other pilots, the 343rd's point man rushed to the coordinates. Almost immediately, they spotted them. 7 F-6F Hellcats, guns loaded and ready. They were newly minted flyers, but unlike Japan, whose pilot pipeline had thinned as the war wore on, the US had kept training robust, ensuring that every aviator who took off was thoroughly prepared to face the enemy. However, not even the best training could prepare a rookie for a pilot like Muto. For every shot the Americans loosed at the Japanese ace, he returned 3, threading through streams of fire as if in an effortless dance. Before the Hellcats could mount a proper counterattack, 4 were already spiraling down. The survivors, unsure what else to do, broke and ran before Muto could reach them. Days later, Japanese newspapers made sure the story was known across the home islands. In the official tale, Muto had faced the enemy alone, no wingmen by his side, compared to a samurai. It wasn't the whole truth, but at this stage of the war, Japan didn't need truth. It needed hope. That was something Muto and his fellow 343rd pilots could still deliver. Before launching the formal invasion of Okinawa, the Americans planned a massive bombing raid to wipe out any airfields that could launch defenders toward the island, and to further cripple what remained of Japan's fleet stationed at Kure in the Hiroshima region. The mission began on March 19th, when over 300 aircraft were readied for the mission. Every pilot wanted to return, but if they had learned anything during the island-hopping campaign, it was that victory always came at a cost. All they could hope was that this time, the cost wouldn't be their own lives. As a group of 20 Hellcats from Task Force 58 closed in on Kure, they suddenly found themselves intercepted by a pack of Japanese defenders. The enemy force was twice their size, closing in at top speed, as if ready to smash straight through them. The moment the US pilots opened fire, they realized these were no ordinary opponents. The way the Shiden-Kai fighters slipped past incoming rounds and swung back into striking position could only be accomplished after years of combat experience. Before the US pilots could regroup, the 343rd were already on their tails. Every evasive maneuver was mirrored, every dive countered. A storm of cannon fire ripped through the skies until Hellcat's engines began trailing smoke, their pilots barely able to keep control as their wounded fuselages lost altitude by the second. The clash lasted less than half an hour. Yet by the time the Americans managed to break free, 6 of their Hellcats had been torn from the sky. Knowing that chasing the 343rd meant certain destruction, the Americans opted to try and bypass the attackers and carry on with their mission, darting toward their targets, dropping payloads, and scrambling to return before their losses mounted further. Nearly 160 Helldiver bombers and Avenger torpedo planes, escorted by 163 Hellcats and Corsairs, unleashed their strike. But even with such overwhelming force, they could do little more than scar the warships below. Every vessel was hit, yet none was sufficiently damaged to be taken out of commission. Meanwhile, the skies over Kure had begun to light up with the fiercest anti-aircraft fire Task Force 58 had ever faced. Black bursts hammered the formations, and with the 343rd still prowling the skies, the Americans knew their window was closing. Then came the worst blow. As the raid faltered, Japanese aircraft slipped past U.S. defenses and struck 2 American carriers. The attacks claimed the lives of over 800 men and left the fleet reeling, morale shaken at a time it needed to be unbreakable. The 343rd Naval Air Group could not win the war alone, but with each clash like this, they had just bought the nation a little bit more time. Before the March 19th campaign was over, the Japanese were handed yet another chance to strike when a group of F-4U Corsairs came into view. These fighters weren't looking for a fight. They had mistaken the silhouette of the N1K2-J Shiden-Kais for that of friendly American Hellcats. By the time they closed in and realized their mistake, it was already too late to pull away. The Corsairs fired against the enemy, scoring a few hits, but none were critical enough to prevent the feared counterattack from the 343rd Shiden-Kais. Cannon fire tore through the skies, forcing the Corsairs into retreat. The chase didn't stop, even as the Americans tried to disengage, diving toward their carriers at top speed. The Shiden stayed locked in their tails, cutting them apart piece by piece until several Corsairs went down in flames. Those that managed to limp back to their decks were so badly damaged that engineers deemed them beyond repair. The only thing that was left to do was to free the vessel from the deadweight, rolling the fighters' carcasses to the edge of the carriers and pushing them into the sea as their assassins looked from above. However, not even the finest pilots in Japan could hold forever against relentless waves of American fighters. As the 343rd Shidens turned for home, fuel tanks running dry, American fighters decided it was time for payback. Unable to maneuver, several Japanese pilots were caught in the open. Some were shot down outright. Others crash-landed in fields of fire before anti-aircraft batteries could drive the attackers away. By the end of the battle, it was estimated that 15 Shidens had been claimed by the Americans. Yet for the Japanese, there was no time to reassess. Just a couple of weeks later, as the Americans launched their formal assault on Okinawa, the 343rd Naval Air Group was ordered back into the skies, this time to escort waves of kamikaze attacks against the fleets closing in. It was not the mission Japan's best aces had trained for, but it was the only way left to use them. And so, as hundreds of aircraft took off on one-way trips, the Shidens flew alongside, carving paths through intercepting Hellcats and Corsairs, ensuring the aircraft around them reached their marks, slamming into American hulls and taking their pilots along with them. The defense of Okinawa inflicted critical losses. Over 7,000 American sailors' lives lost, nearly 20 ships sunk, and 279 more damaged. But neither the kamikaze attacks nor the elite 343rd could stop the Americans, and by summer 1945, Okinawa was lost. Now the Allies were closer than ever to the Japanese mainland, and there was nothing left in the skies that was strong enough to stop them. Three months after the 343rd Naval Air Group had helped fend off the bombing raid aimed at destroying the last remnants of Japan's warships stationed at Kure, the Americans returned, determined to finish the job. On the first day alone, it's estimated that more than 1,700 sorties were launched by American aircraft, striking at every vessel they could spot down below. Bombs and torpedoes rained down on carriers, battleships, and heavy cruisers, crippling some and sinking others. By this stage of the war, there was little for the Allies to gain from such an offensive. Some argue the operation was meant less to win territory than to boost morale for the final push, to exact revenge for Pearl Harbor, and to strip Japan of any bargaining chips it might use in a peace deal. Yet even when fighting for a symbolic victory, the danger was still present. Japan's anti-aircraft batteries still filled the skies with fire. American pilots were cut from the air in mid-dive before they could release their bombs, the wreckage falling alongside the debris of the ships burning down below. And then there were the men of the 343rd. In Europe, Germany had already fallen. But across the Pacific, Japan was resolved to keep the fight going to the bitter end. Once again, the nation's top pilots would take to the skies, just as dangerous in the war's final weeks as they had been in its peak. The Japanese airmen went after the American fighters wherever they got the chance. Each hunt reduced the chances of them coming back to base, but that didn't matter anymore. Among the last fighters was Kaneyoshi Muto, the ace who, according to legend, could fend off an entire clan of Hellcats on his own. On July 24th, as the raids on Kure began once more, he climbed into his Shiden-Kai and rose with his squadron to intercept incoming Hellcats. For years, he'd always found a way to outmaneuver the enemy, no matter how many came against him. But this time, even Japan's fiercest ace could not turn the tide. Surrounded, he fought back with every burst his cannons could deliver. But the Hellcats swarmed him from all sides, their fire hammering into his fuselage until his controls gave way. His Shiden-Kai spiraled into the waves, vanishing into the depths. Neither the man nor the machine was ever seen again. The samurai who had guarded Japan's skies for nearly a decade was gone, taking with him Japan's last hope. The final missions of the 343rd Naval Air Group were flown in early August 1945. Nearly 100 of its elite pilots were already gone, yet the Emperor refused to let his forces lay down their arms. Bound by an unshakable loyalty to the throne, the surviving aviators kept taking off, rising into the skies to intercept the last waves of bombers over Japan. On August 1st, one of these missions fell to Naoshi Kano. His orders were to intercept a formation of American bombers heading toward Yakushima, either to tighten the pressure for surrender or to further weaken Japan's defenses in preparation for Operation Downfall, a planned Allied invasion of the mainland. Months earlier, Kano had asked to be transferred from his unit into a kamikaze squadron, hoping to sacrifice himself for the Empire. His request had been denied. But now, in the last days of the war, he would finally get the chance to give everything for Japan. As he closed in on the bombers, a pack of P-51 Mustangs swept in to cut him off. Retreat was possible, but it was not in Kano's nature to turn away. He threw his Shiden-Kai straight at the enemy, guns blazing. The Mustangs, faster and higher, quickly circled to his rear. Their bursts tore through the sky until one round slammed into his cannon, triggering an explosion that sent his aircraft spiraling out of control. Smoke trailed as his Shiden-Kai came crashing down. Like Kaneyoshi Muto, Naoshi Kano would vanish. Only 5 days later, on August 6th, the first atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. A second followed on August 9th, obliterating Nagasaki. By August 15th, the Emperor finally accepted surrender, putting a definitive ending to the war that had scarred the entire world. The 343rd Naval Air Group had officially been dissolved just 1 day before, keeping its vow to fight until Japan itself fell.